The leather harness bit into white skin as Thomas Whitfield found himself strapped to the very plow he'd forced others to pull. His field hand, a woman named Celia, gripped the whip handle with steady fingers, reversing a power dynamic that had ruled this Tennessee plantation for 20 years. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned the tools of oppression into instruments of justice, forever changing what we think we know about resistance in the antebellum South. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields of Whitfield Plantation like guilty secrets. Dewdrops caught the early light on spider webs stretched between fence posts, while the earth still held the cool dampness of night. The wooden plow waited in the furrow where it had been abandoned the evening before, its iron blade caked with the red clay soil of Middle Tennessee. Celia had risen before dawn, as she had every day for the past 15 years. Her calloused hands moved through the familiar motions of preparing for field work, but her mind carried the weight of a decision that would either free her or kill her. The previous night had brought news that would change everything. Her youngest son, Samuel, had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi. At 12 years old, he would be loaded onto a wagon that afternoon, disappearing forever into the vast machinery of human bondage. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel announced Thomas Whitfield's arrival. His polished boots created a steady rhythm against the morning stillness, each step marking the cadence of absolute authority. He carried his usual riding crop, a braided leather instrument that had tasted the blood of countless backs. Behind him walked his overseer, Jenkins, a man whose cruelty had earned him a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. "Get that plow moving," Whitfield commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air. "That south field won't prepare itself." Celia had worked these fields since she was 14, purchased at auction in Nashville along with her mother and infant son. She had watched seasons change and crops grow, while her own children were conceived in violence and raised in bondage. Every furrow she had plowed represented another day of survival, another moment stolen from freedom. But Thomas Whitfield had made a mistake that morning. Perhaps it was overconfidence, or maybe the whiskey from the previous night still clouded his judgment. He had sent Jenkins to the barn to retrieve additional harnesses, leaving himself alone with a woman who had nothing left to lose. Before we continue deeper into this moment that would echo through Tennessee history, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over a century and a half. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the August sun, row upon row of plants heavy with the white bolls that built fortunes on broken backs. Celia understood that landscape better than the man who owned it. She knew which furrows held water after rain, where the soil grew thin, how the earth responded to different tools and techniques. This knowledge, accumulated through years of forced labor, would become her weapon. When Whitfield bent to examine a broken harness strap, Celia moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her dreams. The thick rope used to secure mules hung coiled on a fence post, and she grabbed it with the same efficiency she brought to every task. The master, who had never imagined his property might fight back, found himself overwhelmed by 15 years of suppressed rage, channeled into decisive action. "What do you think you're doing?" he sputtered, but his words carried less authority when his hands were being bound behind his back. The rope that had secured countless animals to their burdens now held a different kind of beast. Celia worked quickly, using knots she had learned from watching the stable hands prepare the most stubborn mules. Her fingers moved with muscle memory, creating restraints that would hold against even desperate struggling. The plow harness, designed to transform animal strength into agricultural labor, fit Thomas Whitfield with disturbing appropriateness. The leather straps that had chafed the shoulders of oxen now pressed against the soft flesh of a man who had never known physical hardship. Metal buckles clicked into place, with the sound of chains being forged. "The field needs plowing," Celia said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Time to work. But this reversal of power carried dangers that extended far beyond one plantation. The whip cracked through morning air with the same sound that had measured Celia's days for 15 years. Now the leather sang a different song as Thomas Whitfield stumbled forward, his polished boots slipping in the red Tennessee clay he had never touched before. Every stroke of that whip represented a choice between justice and survival in a world where neither was guaranteed for people who looked like Celia. The harness leather cut into Whitfield's shoulders as he leaned into the plow's weight. His starched white shirt, tailored in Nashville and worth more than most enslaved people earned in a year, darkened with sweat and soil. The iron blade behind him carved furrows through earth that had drunk the blood and tears of generations, creating lines as straight as the moral clarity Celia had found in her desperation. "Move faster," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that slavery had tried to steal but never fully claimed. "The cotton won't plant itself." Jenkins would return from the barn within the hour. That gave Celia 60 minutes to accomplish something that had never been recorded in the annals of Tennessee plantation life. She drove Whitfield across the field with the methodical pace of someone who understood that rushed work led to crooked rows. Even in rebellion, her training held firm. The sound of Whitfield's labored breathing mixed with the grinding of iron against soil created a symphony of reversed fortunes. His hands, soft from a lifetime of giving orders rather than following them, began to blister where the harness straps rubbed. Blood seeped through his shirt where the leather bit deepest, marking him with the same wounds he had inflicted on others for sport. From the diary of Margaret Whitfield, August 15, 1860, "Thomas has grown increasingly harsh with the field hands. I fear his methods will bring consequences we cannot foresee." The other enslaved workers in distant fields could see the impossible tableau unfolding in the south pasture. Some paused in their labor to stare, while others kept their heads down, understanding that witnesses to such reversals rarely live to tell about them. Moses, the oldest field hand, watched through tears that carried 50 years of accumulated grief. Sarah, barely 16 and heavy with her master's unwanted child, allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction before fear reclaimed her features. But their reactions revealed something crucial about plantation dynamics that few historians have ever documented. The enslaved community had developed an intricate system of signals and warnings that functioned like an invisible telegraph network. Hand gestures meant overseer approaching. Specific work songs warned of danger. Even the way someone held their hoe could communicate volumes to those who knew the code. That morning, the signal being passed between fields was unlike any they had ever transmitted. Revolution had a new language. Whitfield collapsed after 30 minutes, his knees hitting the soil with the sound of authority surrendering to reality. The plow tilted sideways, its blade catching on a root system that had grown deep during Tennessee's wet summer. Sweat poured down his face, carrying away the certainty that had sustained him through 20 years of human ownership. "Please," he gasped, the word foreign on his tongue. Masters didn't plead. Masters commanded, threatened, punished. But leather harnesses and iron plows recognized no social hierarchies, only the physics of weight and resistance. Celia stood over him with the whip still coiled in her hand, her shadow falling across his prostrate form like a judgment pronounced by forces larger than plantation law. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities that neither could fully comprehend. She held the power to end his life or grant mercy, to complete her transformation from property to person, or to retreat into the familiar safety of subservience. Around them, the cotton plants swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of coming rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, suggesting that nature itself was preparing to wash away whatever blood might be spilled before sunset. What would you have done, standing over the man who had stolen your children, controlled your body, and treated your life as a commodity to be bought and sold. The question that would define the next hour was whether Celia sought justice or simply revenge. Thunder rolled across the Tennessee hills as Celia raised the whip for what she knew would be the final time. The leather whistled through humid air before finding its mark across Thomas Whitfield's back, opening flesh that had never known the bite of discipline. This single moment would determine whether one woman's rebellion sparked a wider uprising or ended in the brutal public execution that awaited all who dared challenge the natural order. The red welts blooming across Whitfield's shoulders told a story written in blood and retribution. Each mark represented a child sold away, a woman violated, a man worked to death in fields that enriched everyone except those who tended them. Celia had kept careful count over the years, storing each injustice in her memory like coins saved for a purchase she never thought she'd be able to make. Jenkins would discover them soon. The overseer's routine was as predictable as sunrise, and his absence from the south field had already stretched beyond normal limits. When he returned with the fresh harnesses, he would find a tableau that challenged every assumption about power, race, and control that had governed plantation life since the first ships arrived from Africa. The enslaved community's invisible telegraph network buzzed with unprecedented signals. In the near field, old Moses had begun singing a work song, with lyrics that seemed innocent but carried urgent warnings. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. The melody drifted across the cotton rows, alerting others that something momentous was happening in the south pasture. Sarah, the pregnant teenager, picked up the song and modified it slightly, adding verses that transformed it into a coded bulletin. Other voices joined, creating a harmony that masked communication in plain sight. To any white observer, they were simply enslaved people, singing spirituals while they worked. To those who understood the language of survival, every note carried intelligence about Celia's unprecedented reversal of fortune. But the singing also served another purpose. It provided cover for the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the main road. Dr. William Hayes had ridden over from the neighboring plantation to discuss a boundary dispute with Whitfield. His medical practice served the white families of 3 counties, and his arrival at precisely 11:30 that morning represented the kind of coincidence that changes history. Through the trees separating the main house from the fields, he could see something that made him rein in his horse and stare in disbelief. A white man was strapped to a plow. A black woman held a whip. The natural order of things had been turned completely upside down. Hayes faced a choice that would define his character and potentially his survival. He could ride directly to the scene and attempt to restore white authority through violence or persuasion. He could continue to the main house and sound an alarm that would bring armed men running, or he could pretend he had seen nothing, completing his business with Margaret Whitfield and leaving Celia to face whatever consequences awaited her rebellion. From the Adams County Courthouse records, August 15, 1860, Dr. Hayes testified that he observed unusual activity in the Southfield, but deemed it prudent to continue to the main house rather than intervene directly. The doctor's hesitation revealed something crucial about the psychology of white supremacy. When faced with evidence that their assumptions about racial hierarchy might be wrong, many whites chose denial over confrontation. Hayes had built his reputation on certainty, diagnosing illnesses and prescribing treatments with a confidence that came from medical training and social position. But the scene in the South Field challenged diagnostic categories that had no precedent in his experience. Meanwhile, Celia faced her own moment of truth. Whitfield lay motionless in the furrow, his breathing shallow but steady. The harness still bound him to the plow, but his unconscious state had temporarily suspended the power dynamic between them. She could cut his bonds and claim the entire incident was some kind of accident or misunderstanding. She could complete what she had started and ensure he never rose to punish her. Or she could simply disappear into the woods, leaving others to discover whatever remained. The weight of the whip in her hand felt lighter now, as if the violence had drained away its substance along with its symbolism. What remained was a woman standing in a cotton field, surrounded by the evidence of her rebellion. With 60 seconds to choose between survival strategies that all carried the risk of death, thunder rolled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall on soil that had already been watered with too much blood. But Celia's decision would have to wait, because Jenkins had just emerged from the barn with fresh harnesses draped over his shoulders. Jenkins froze at the tree line, harnesses slipping from his shoulders to hit the ground with the dull thud of leather on earth. His mind struggled to process the impossible scene before him. Thomas Whitfield, unconscious in a furrow, still strapped to the plow like a common draft animal. The overseer's reaction would determine whether this rebellion remained a private reckoning or exploded into the kind of slave uprising that haunted every white family's nightmares. Celia turned to face Jenkins, with the whip still coiled in her grip, her expression carrying the calm of someone who had already accepted death as the likely price of her actions. The distance between them stretched 40 yards, enough space for one of them to make a choice that would define the next few minutes. Jenkins carried a pistol, standard equipment for plantation overseers, but his hand remained frozen at his side. The moment revealed something profound about the psychology of oppression. Jenkins had built his identity around controlling people who outnumbered him 20-1. His authority depended on the collective belief that resistance was impossible, that the natural order could never be challenged. But Celia's rebellion had shattered that illusion, leaving him paralyzed by the recognition that his power was an elaborate performance that only worked when everyone agreed to play their assigned roles. Rain began falling harder, turning the red clay soil into slick mud that would make running treacherous for anyone foolish enough to try. The sound of droplets hitting cotton leaves created a percussion that mixed with the distant singing from other fields, where enslaved workers continued their coded communication about the unprecedented events unfolding in the South pasture. Dr. Hayes, still mounted on his horse near the main house, found himself caught between competing moral calculations. His medical oath required him to tend to the injured, but approaching the scene would force him to take sides in a confrontation that challenged everything he believed about racial hierarchy. He could see Margaret Whitfield through the parlor window, unaware that her husband lay unconscious in a cotton field, and he faced the choice of maintaining that ignorance or shattering it with information that would demand immediate action. The paralysis of white witnesses became a crucial factor in Celia's survival. Each person who might have intervened chose inaction instead, creating a bubble of suspended time where impossible things could continue happening. From the Tennessee State Archives, testimony of Jenkins Morrison, September 3, 1860. I observed what appeared to be some kind of accident in the south field, but deemed it prudent to assess the situation before taking precipitous action. Jenkins finally moved, but not toward Celia or his unconscious master. Instead, he backed slowly toward the barn, his eyes never leaving the woman who had somehow reversed the fundamental power dynamic of plantation life. His retreat represented more than cowardice. It was an unconscious acknowledgement that the world he understood had temporarily ceased to exist. The singing from the distant fields grew louder, more voices joining the coded communication network that was now broadcasting news of Celia's rebellion across the entire plantation. Old Moses had recruited others to help maintain the musical cover, creating a wall of sound that would mask whatever came next. The spirituals took on an urgency that suggested the enslaved community understood they were witnessing history, even if they couldn't predict how it would end. Celia knelt beside Whitfield's unconscious form, checking his pulse with the same careful attention she had learned from watching Dr. Hayes tend to sick enslaved workers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now providing medical care to the man she had just finished punishing. But her actions revealed something crucial about her motivations. This wasn't random violence or mindless revenge. It was calculated justice administered by someone who understood the difference between correction and cruelty. The harness straps had cut deep enough to draw blood, but not deep enough to cause permanent damage. Celia had measured her retribution with the precision of someone who had spent years calculating exactly how much suffering she could endure without breaking. Now she applied that same mathematical approach to dispensing punishment, ensuring that Whitfield would survive, to remember what it felt like to be treated as property. But survival carried its own complications. A living witness could identify his attacker, demand prosecution, and ensure that Celia faced the kind of public execution designed to terrorize other potential rebels. A dead master might be explained away as an accident, a tragic mishap that occurred while he was inspecting field equipment. The weight of life and death decisions pressed down on Celia like the humidity that made Tennessee summers nearly unbearable. What would you have done? Holding the life of your oppressor in your hands, knowing that mercy might mean your own destruction. But the choice was about to be taken away from her, because the sound of approaching horses meant that someone had finally decided to act. The hoofbeats belonged to Sheriff William Donovan and 2 deputies summoned by a field hand who had broken ranks and run to town with news of the impossible scene unfolding at Whitfield Plantation. Their horses splashed through puddles of red mud as rain continued to fall on soil that had become a stage for history. This moment would test whether Tennessee's legal system could process a crime that challenged every assumption about justice, property, and human worth. Celia heard them coming before she saw them, the rhythm of shod hooves on wet earth, creating a drumbeat that measured the final seconds of her unprecedented rebellion. She stood slowly, still holding the whip, and faced the tree line where 3 armed men would soon emerge. The calculation was simple. Surrender meant trial and execution. Resistance meant immediate death. And running meant being hunted down like the escaped property she had always been classified as under Tennessee law. Whitfield stirred in the furrow, consciousness returning just as the forces of legal authority arrived to restore the natural order. His first coherent words were predictable: "Kill her." But his voice carried the weakness of a man who had been broken by his own tools, and the command lacked the automatic authority that had governed his previous interactions with law enforcement. Sheriff Donovan had served Adams County for 12 years, building his reputation on the swift resolution of disputes between white property owners. But the scene that greeted him in the South Field fell outside his previous experience. Tennessee law was clear about the penalties for enslaved people who assaulted their masters, but it provided no precedent for situations where the assault involved such a complete reversal of traditional power dynamics. The sheriff's hesitation lasted only seconds, but those seconds revealed the fundamental instability of a legal system built on the premise that certain categories of people were inherently incapable of moral agency. If Celia could make complex decisions about justice and punishment, if she could exercise the kind of calculated restraint that had kept Whitfield alive, then perhaps the entire philosophical foundation of slavery required re-examination. But philosophical questions would have to wait for practical ones. From the Adams County Sheriff's Department records, August 15, 1860, arrested 1 Negro woman, name of Celia, for assault upon her master. Suspect showed no resistance to lawful authority. Celia's surrender was as calculated as her rebellion. She dropped the whip and extended her hands for the iron shackles that had been forged in the same foundries that produced the chains used to transport enslaved people from auction blocks to plantations. The metal was cold against her wrists, familiar weight that connected her present moment to a lifetime of bondage. The deputies moved to cut Whitfield free from the plow harness, their knives slicing through leather that had held him in a position no white man in Tennessee had ever experienced. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that the same tools used to restrain enslaved people were now being used to liberate their former master from an identical fate. Dr. Hayes finally approached from the main house, his medical bag in hand, and his conscience apparently reconciled to treating the injuries that resulted from Celia's rebellion. His examination revealed multiple lacerations across Whitfield's back and shoulders, wounds that would heal but leave permanent scars as reminders of the day his property had temporarily become his master. The enslaved community's singing had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight. News of Celia's arrest would spread through the invisible telegraph network, carrying implications that extended far beyond one woman's fate. If she could be executed for her rebellion, what message would that send to others who harbored similar grievances? If she could somehow escape punishment, what precedent would that establish for future acts of resistance? Margaret Whitfield emerged from the main house, her face pale with shock as she processed the scene that had unfolded while she arranged flowers in the parlor. The contrast between her morning routine and the revolutionary events in the cotton field illustrated the dangerous complacency that had settled over plantation society, the assumption that the enslaved population would remain forever passive and grateful for their condition. But Celia's rebellion had shattered that assumption, creating ripples that would spread across Tennessee and beyond. Word of a field hand who had harnessed her master like a mule would reach other plantations, other counties, other states where similar power dynamics governed daily life. The story would be told in hushed whispers in slave quarters, gaining details and significance with each retelling until it became legend. The real question was whether that legend would inspire more rebellion or serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of challenging white authority. As the sheriff's wagon rolled toward town with Celia shackled in the back, rain continued to fall on the abandoned plow, washing away the blood, but leaving the furrows that marked where Tennessee history had taken an unexpected turn. But Celia's story was far from over, because her trial would reveal secrets about plantation life that some people would kill to keep buried. The Adams County Courthouse buzzed with tension as unprecedented crowds gathered for a trial that would test the very foundations of Tennessee justice. Celia sat in iron shackles, the first enslaved person in county history to face charges for harming her master in such a calculated, deliberate manner. Her case would force 12 white men to decide whether property could commit murder or if justice applied equally to all who drew breath in Tennessee soil. The courtroom reeked of tobacco smoke and nervous sweat, while outside, late summer heat made the air shimmer like liquid glass. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of plantation owners who had traveled from across 3 counties to witness this legal precedent. They understood that Celia's fate would determine whether their own human property might someday turn against them with similar calculation and precision. Judge Harrison Blackwell had presided over Adams County courts for 18 years, building his reputation on swift, decisive rulings that upheld social order and white supremacy. But Celia's case presented legal complexities that challenged his judicial philosophy. Tennessee law recognized enslaved people as property, but it also prescribed criminal penalties for property that harmed its owners. The contradiction revealed a fundamental flaw in the legal architecture of slavery. Prosecutor James Mitchell opened his case with language designed to terrify every white person in the courtroom. Gentlemen of the jury, we face a crisis that threatens the very foundation of civilized society. If we allow this woman's actions to go unpunished, we invite chaos, rebellion, and the complete destruction of the natural order that has governed our state since its founding. But Celia's court-appointed defense attorney, Robert Crawford, had discovered something during his investigation that would change everything. Hidden in Thomas Whitfield's personal papers was evidence of financial crimes that made his treatment of enslaved people seem almost benevolent by comparison. The man who claimed moral authority over dozens of human beings had been systematically defrauding his neighbors, forging land deeds, and embezzling funds from the county treasury. The revelation that Whitfield was a criminal created an impossible moral equation for the all-white jury. Could they execute a woman for assaulting a man whose own crimes violated the trust of their community? Did criminal behavior by a master invalidate his authority over his property? The questions had no legal precedent in Tennessee or anywhere else in the antebellum South. From the Nashville Banner, August 22, 1860. The trial of the Negro woman Celia has revealed disturbing evidence of corruption among our most prominent citizens. The implications extend far beyond one plantation. Dr. Hayes took the witness stand with obvious reluctance, his testimony carefully crafted to avoid admitting that he had witnessed Celia's rebellion without intervening. But cross-examination revealed his cowardice, and more importantly, his medical opinion that Whitfield's injuries were consistent with measured punishment rather than murderous intent. The distinction suggested that Celia had exercised the kind of restraint that implied moral reasoning, a dangerous admission in a legal system that denied enslaved people possess such capabilities. Jenkins, the overseer, proved to be an even more problematic witness. His testimony revealed years of brutal treatment that went far beyond the legal limits of slave discipline. Under oath, he described whippings that left permanent scars, forced breeding programs that violated basic human dignity, and punishment techniques that bordered on torture. The jury listened with growing discomfort as they realized that Whitfield's plantation operated more like a prison camp than an agricultural enterprise. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Margaret Whitfield, called to testify about her husband's character, broke down completely on the witness stand. Years of suppressed guilt poured out as she described the systematic sexual abuse of enslaved women, the sale of children torn from their mothers' arms, and the casual violence that had become routine at their plantation. "I knew it was wrong," she sobbed, her voice barely audible above the courtroom's stunned silence. "I knew it was wrong, but I said nothing. God, forgive me. I said nothing." Her testimony transformed the trial from a simple case of property crime into a broader examination of plantation morality. If Whitfield's own wife acknowledged his cruelty, how could the jury condemn Celia for responding to it? The legal system found itself in the impossible position of prosecuting someone for rebelling against conditions that even white witnesses admitted were unconscionable. Crawford's closing argument lasted 3 hours, during which he systematically dismantled every assumption about slavery, justice, and human worth that the jury had brought into the courtroom. "Gentlemen, we are asked to execute a woman for defending herself against a man whose crimes make her rebellion seem like justice. We are asked to uphold a legal system that creates monsters and then punishes their victims for fighting back." The jury deliberated for 6 hours, an unusually long time for a case involving an enslaved defendant. When they returned, their verdict would send shockwaves through Tennessee and beyond, challenging assumptions about race, justice, and human nature that had governed Southern society for generations. But their decision was only the beginning of a legal battle that would expose secrets powerful enough to topple governments. The jury foreman's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper that would determine whether Tennessee executed a woman for defending herself or acknowledged that enslaved people possessed the same moral agency as their masters. His voice cracked when he spoke the words that no one in the courtroom expected to hear. "We find the defendant not guilty by reason of justified defense." The verdict shattered every legal precedent in Tennessee history and sent immediate shockwaves through a state already teetering on the edge of civil war. For the first time since statehood, a jury of white men had ruled that an enslaved person's violence against their master could be legally justified, effectively recognizing that property could possess moral reasoning and the right to self-defense. Judge Blackwell sat in stunned silence for nearly 2 minutes before finding his voice. The legal implications of the verdict extended far beyond Celia's case, potentially invalidating the entire philosophical foundation of slavery in Tennessee. If enslaved people could claim justified defense, what prevented them from arguing that their entire condition constituted an ongoing assault worthy of violent resistance? The courtroom erupted in chaos as plantation owners shouted protests, while abolitionists, who had traveled from Nashville, cheered the unprecedented recognition of enslaved humanity. Sheriff Donovan struggled to maintain order as fistfights broke out between opposing factions, each side understanding that this verdict represented a fundamental shift in the legal landscape of human bondage. But the celebration proved premature. Within hours of the verdict, Tennessee Governor Isham Harris issued an emergency proclamation declaring the jury's decision null and void due to legal incompetence. The governor's action had no constitutional basis, but it reflected the political reality that acknowledging enslaved people's right to self-defense would make slavery legally impossible to maintain. From the Tennessee State Archives, Governor Harris's emergency proclamation, August 24, 1860. No jury in this state possesses authority to grant legal standing to property in rebellion against its lawful owners. Such recognition threatens the foundation of civilized society. Celia found herself in legal limbo, neither free nor condemned, while lawyers across the state debated whether governors possessed the authority to overturn jury verdicts. The constitutional crisis attracted attention from Washington, where politicians already struggling with sectional tensions over slavery faced yet another complication in their attempts to preserve national unity. Crawford, her defense attorney, filed immediate appeals with both state and federal courts, arguing that the governor's intervention violated basic principles of judicial independence. But the legal process would take months, leaving Celia imprisoned, while her case became a symbol for competing visions of American justice and human rights. Meanwhile, the evidence of Thomas Whitfield's criminal activities continued to emerge. Federal investigators discovered that his embezzlement schemes had defrauded the county treasury of nearly $50,000, funds that had been used to purchase additional enslaved people and expand his plantation's operations. The revelation that slavery had been financed through theft created another layer of moral complexity in an already unprecedented case. Margaret Whitfield's testimony had also triggered a broader investigation into plantation conditions across Tennessee. State officials, pressured by abolitionists and embarrassed by national attention, began conducting surprise inspections that revealed systematic abuse at dozens of agricultural operations. The political ramifications extended beyond Tennessee, as other southern states worried that similar investigations might expose comparable conditions in their own territories. Dr. Hayes found his medical practice under scrutiny as investigators questioned his role in treating injuries that resulted from plantation violence. His patient records revealed a pattern of suspicious wounds and mysterious deaths that suggested widespread abuse had been systematically covered up by the medical establishment. The doctor who had hesitated to intervene during Celia's rebellion now faced questions about his complicity in years of documented torture. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Enslaved people across Tennessee began coming forward with their own stories of abuse, emboldened by Celia's case to speak truths that had been suppressed for generations. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic brutality that challenged every romantic myth about benevolent masters and contented slaves. The wave of revelations created a crisis for Tennessee's political establishment, which had built its reputation on claims that slavery in their state was more humane than in other southern regions. Evidence suggested that Tennessee plantations were actually among the most brutal in the South, their violence hidden behind a veneer of respectability that had fooled even sympathetic observers. As winter approached, Celia remained in the Adams County Jail, while her case worked its way through appeals courts that had no precedent for such legal questions. Her rebellion had exposed contradictions in American law and morality that threatened to tear apart not just Tennessee, but the entire nation. The woman who had strapped her master to a plow had accidentally triggered a legal revolution that would reshape how America understood justice, human rights, and the fundamental question of who deserved protection under law. But powerful forces were already working to ensure that Celia's victory would be temporary and that the precedent she had established would never be allowed to spread beyond Tennessee's borders. Federal marshals arrived in Adams County on a gray December morning, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air as they marched toward the courthouse with orders that would erase Celia's legal victory from Tennessee history. The documents they carried bore the seal of the United States Supreme Court and the signature of Chief Justice Roger Taney, architect of the Dred Scott decision. The highest court in the land had ruled that enslaved people possessed no legal standing to claim self-defense, effectively nullifying every aspect of Celia's unprecedented acquittal and restoring the natural order that her rebellion had temporarily disrupted. The courthouse steps had frozen overnight, creating a treacherous surface that forced the marshals to move carefully as they approached the building where Celia had won the most significant legal victory for enslaved people in American history. Ice crystals clung to the iron railings like prison bars, while inside, Sheriff Donovan prepared to transfer his most famous prisoner to federal custody for immediate execution. Crawford, her defense attorney, had exhausted every legal avenue available under American law. His final appeal to the Supreme Court had been dismissed without oral argument, the justices ruling unanimously that the Tennessee jury had exceeded its constitutional authority by recognizing legal rights that belonged exclusively to white citizens. The decision, written by Taney himself, declared that persons of African descent, whether enslaved or free, possess no standing under American law to claim protection from their superiors. But the federal intervention revealed something more sinister than simple legal correction. Investigation into the timing of the Supreme Court's involvement uncovered evidence that Thomas Whitfield's criminal activities had extended far beyond embezzlement and fraud. His financial network included federal judges, congressmen, and cabinet members who had profited from his schemes and now faced exposure if Celia's case continued to attract national attention. From the Washington National Intelligencer, December 15, 1860, the swift resolution of the Tennessee slave case demonstrates our nation's commitment to constitutional order and the proper boundaries of legal authority. The article failed to mention that 3 of the Supreme Court justices owned shares in the same banks that Whitfield had used to launder his stolen funds. The conflict of interest went beyond financial considerations to encompass the fundamental question of whether American law could acknowledge enslaved humanity without destroying the economic system that relied on their dehumanization. Celia's final night in the Adams County Jail was marked by an unprecedented gathering outside the courthouse. Enslaved people from plantations across 3 counties had somehow coordinated their presence, creating a silent vigil that filled the town square with hundreds of witnesses to what everyone understood would be the end of their brief moment of legal recognition. The silence was more powerful than any protest could have been. No speeches, no songs, no visible displays of anger or grief. Just the presence of people who had been briefly acknowledged as human beings and now faced the restoration of their legal invisibility. Their quiet dignity in the face of federal authority created a moral tableau that exposed the bankruptcy of American justice more effectively than any courtroom argument. Dr. Hayes watched from his office window as the crowd grew through the night, their breath creating a collective fog that hung over the square like the ghost of possibilities that would never be realized. His medical records had been confiscated by federal authorities, evidence of plantation brutality disappearing into government files that would remain sealed for decades. Margaret Whitfield had suffered a complete mental collapse following her courtroom testimony, her guilt-induced breakdown requiring constant medical supervision that kept her isolated from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about her knowledge of her husband's crimes. The woman who had briefly told the truth about plantation life now lived in medicated silence, her inconvenient honesty chemically suppressed. But the most telling response came from other enslaved people who had been inspired by Celia's rebellion to speak their own truths. Federal marshals systematically visited plantations across Tennessee, warning enslaved communities that anyone who followed Celia's example would face immediate execution without trial. The message was clear. The brief moment of legal recognition had been an aberration that would never be repeated. As dawn broke on December 16, 1860, Celia was led from her cell to face a justice that had been predetermined by forces far more powerful than Tennessee juries or constitutional principles. The woman who had strapped her master to a plow and briefly convinced 12 white men that enslaved people deserved legal protection walked toward her execution with the same dignity she had shown throughout her impossible trial. The federal marshals had prepared a scaffold in the courthouse square, positioned so that every member of the enslaved community would be forced to witness the consequences of rebellion. But they had not anticipated the quiet revolution that Celia's case had already accomplished in the hearts and minds of people who would never again accept their legal invisibility without question. Her execution would end one story, but it would begin another that would echo through Tennessee hills for generations. To this day, local residents claim they sometimes see a woman in the early morning mist walking the old cotton fields with a whip in her hand, still seeking justice that the law refused to provide. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.